Hi, welcome back to the More Insights and Strategy podcast. I am here with Vice President and Principal Analyst Matt. How about that? Isn't that great? I love
Hello,
you.
Mr.
Matt
Moorhead.
Kimball. Matt has a last name. But Matt, it's great to see you. And
You,
I am just so excited to talk about one of my favorite topics that literally pretty sure half of my effort has gone into since generative AI was invented back early, at the very end of last year. And by the way, I'm joking, folks. But anyways, Matt, it's great to see you.
you as well. It's been a minute, hasn't it?
It really has, flying all around. Each one of these tech vendors added an event for generative AI, but no, it's the real deal. I think it's good. And by the way, one of the topics that just doesn't get enough airtime and enough discussion, and I've been very vocal with this, is what is the role of data in generative AI? And I kind of wanted to auger in like that. Even the first computer class that I took, I'm going to say in the 80s, not give you an exact year, really talked about garbage in and garbage out. Right. So you would think by the year 2023, almost 35 years later, we would get the role of unified asset and data management. But let's
Yeah.
dive in here, and I'm gonna interview you, Matt. This is gonna be great.
Fun. All right.
Sometimes I'm the interviewer, sometimes an interview. We're gonna have a great conversation here. So let's kick this off. So, obviously generative AI is the thing, and obviously a joke that it was invented a few years ago. In fact, the first AI algorithms were developed in the 1960s. Now that was a different type of AI, but
Mhm.
AI is not exactly new. So, um, can you talk about maybe how generative AI differs from the old AI?
Yeah.
Again, joke fans, and how does this relate to data out there?
Yeah, I'm glad it's actually an interesting topic, and I'm with you. It's funny, Gen AI is all the rage, or generative AI, however we want to talk about it. But as you say, AI has been around forever, right? I mean, it's seemingly forever, and it's in use in a lot of enterprises today. What I think is, we've used AI in the past. You can call it kind of discriminatory AI to do things, right? Get things done, make a process move smoother, more efficiently, faster, obviously, with no errors or with fewer errors. Assembly lines, robotic process automation, so on and so forth. Generative AI is kind of the learning phase, right? As you use it in life sciences and use it in other kind of areas to help in discovery and in learning more and doing things and learning faster, which drives, if you think about like pharmaceutical industry, it's the process, it shortens the process by which you can discover drugs and get them out to market. It's super interesting, but it like AI, it's all data driven. And you hit it on the head. Garbage in, garbage out. There's I think this notion in the market that more is better when it comes to data, and directionally that's true. But the more accurate way of saying that is, more relevant data is better, more timely data is better, not just more data in general. And I know you talk to CIOs, you talk to IT executives, business leaders. I do as well. And we talk about digital transformation and the role of AI in digital transformation. And one of the interesting things that I find is that while folks talk about kind of, IT executives talk about the fact that they need to figure out a data strategy for feeding AI models, Gen AI models, those large language models or foundational models they're using, they often are not complete in their views, right? It's I have all this data that's sitting in all of these data lakes or data repositories around the enterprise, or I have this data that's being generated on the edge now, which is all true. But they forget about, not always, but oftentimes there's this forgetting that I have all of these physical assets that start out as kind of just like raw information that I don't always consider as part of my my kind of data strategy, my asset management strategy, right? It could be like recordings if I'm a law firm. It could be recordings and video recordings of depositions and all of those artifacts. It could be case law that I've created, or files I've created over time that I've stored away and I've forgotten to digitize and make part of my asset pool, my digital asset pool. And it's shocking to me that as we kind of go headstrong into this Gen AI thing and into this data thing, that we forget about these assets that are sitting right under our noses. So that's when we think about kind of Gen AI and the data story. It's just interesting to me that as we go so hard and so fast, we forget about kind of some of these basics when it comes to managing information across its life cycle.
Yeah, I like to look at generative AI. I mean, the process is different, and between, let's say, machine learning for vision, the data set is very narrow. Okay.
Mhm.
And with generative AI, with foundational models, you start with a very broad model. Now, it can be a little bit narrow, but the thing to do today is start out very broad, and then you ground against it, which is just a fancy word for high volume prompting. Maybe you're putting in proprietary data or something like that. You broached, I don't know if you use the exact word, but this information life cycle
Yeah.
of data created and in the end how you're gaining insights from it. What exactly is this? And in fact, you wrote a paper on it that talked about the information life cycle.
Yeah, it's this notion of looking at everything across the enterprise, everything across the organization as a source of information, and how you manage the collection, the digitization in some cases, the not collation, but the gathering of this data, how you transform it, how you figure out what's relevant, what's not relevant, what feeds a Gen AI model, what sits just in archive, and how you kind of manage that from kind of the moment of creation or the moment of discovery to the point of archiving. And it's interesting. It goes back to this. As you talk to CIOs, as you talk to IT executives, as you talk to folks that are looking at both digital transformation and how they step back for a second. I know of this thing called, as an IT person, I know of this thing called AI and Gen AI, and I know it adds value into my organization, but how exactly does it add value? And as I kind of go down each one of these vectors, what information or what data is required to make that Gen AI implementation relevant and accurate and real for me. That's what information lifecycle management is all about. It's kind of figuring that out, putting the processes in place, and then actually going through the steps of digitizing all of your assets, of managing them, transforming them, tagging them, managing them, understanding what data feeds what models, what data does not feed, as importantly or maybe more importantly, and how you manage that. And by the way, when you're done with all of this, what do you do with all those physical assets? What do you do with all your digital data? How do you
Right.
take all this unstructured data and make it matter? That's what information lifecycle management is all about. And it's interesting again because it's like we oftentimes think immediately to those SQL databases or those big data repositories we have, and we forget about all of these other things that are around us that contain such important sources of data, ultimately of data.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty incredible demonstrations of taking PDFs and turning that into, I mean, being able to query it with natural language and different types of data, the videos, the conversations, the audio conversations, is really just making this conversation about information lifecycle even more important. And in fact, in generative AI, we're creating new types of data that as well that need to be managed. And the final thing, just to make a long story longer, um, the other thing that's different with generative AI, and we haven't seen this yet because most of the data is focused on some narrow areas, let's say like customer service, is you're going to see cross-pollination of data,
Yes.
which is connecting your back end of the enterprise, the front end, ERP information to CX. It's going to include proprietary customer information that's intermingled inside of data today. Now, most enterprises are focusing narrowly right now, but it is definitely where the puck is going.
To what you're saying, Pat, I think we're in a really interesting phase when we think about AI in general. I think we're in a really interesting phase in that, like we talked about at the beginning, you've had these very discrete uses of AI in the past, an assembly line or, kind of, like we talked about robotic process automation, RPA, stuff like that, right? Gen AI, I think, is going to be a killer app for AI, if you will, and that an enterprise is going to get it. They're going to go, this is the value it delivers, and it is going to spur or spurn or spawn all of these other CIOs are going to go, wait a minute, it worked over here. What if I used, and it may not even be Gen AI, but some other kind of flavor, if you will, of AI over in this part of my organization and that part of and you're going to see it kind of, I believe it's going to cause like a wildfire effect, right? And you're going to see these projects pop up around the organization, and that cross-pollination of data is going to be huge when it comes to kind of figuring out where I can drive value within the organization. Because to what we've been talking about, AI has been kind of science fiction-y for so long outside of those very discrete uses, and we never think of those as AI. We just think of them as automated manufacturing or something along those lines.
So Matt, when I'm talking to IT and business leaders, one thread is 100% true, and that is we need to show that we're doing something very useful with generative AI, and it came from board mandate, right? That goes down to the CEO, that goes down to the L1s. That it reminds me a lot of the cloud mandate,
Oh
right?
yeah, yep.
And so I was curious, I think we both have a general agreement that information lifecycle is super important. And by the way, look at everything I've written, podcasted on, tweeted on. My biggest irritation, particularly on-prem implementations or even sub-implementations where you pull the foundational model out of the public cloud and then you ground against it on-prem, was this lack of discussion of data. It's like, folks, how are we going to tackle this? And I'm curious, Matt, what are you seeing? What are some of the biggest mistakes that maybe IT or business leaders are making, or maybe what they're thinking through as it relates to this information life cycle?
Yeah, I think for me there are three big areas that I see fairly commonly when I talk to IT and business folks. And the first is the more is better mindset, right? And it's kind of like you liken it to the cloud, and that's a perfect analogy, right? It was like the cloud is going to solve all of our problems, and let's just go throw everything in the cloud. And then it's almost like a cartoon, right? I mean, 2 years later, they're like, wait a minute, this is not what I thought, and it's not costing what I thought. And there was this kind of repatriation, or a few years later, there's kind of repatriation
Kind
and
of,
kind of right. Look at
kind of.
balancing, right? I
There's
call it a
still
last,
net new workloads are still
yeah.
going to the public cloud. But listen, we're 14 years into the public cloud, and 75 to 90% of the data is still on prem or on the edge.
Yep. Yeah. Right. So there's a rationalization that happens, right? It's kind of like you figure out, and then you figure out where the sweet spot is for implementing. And I think when it comes to AI and it comes to data in general, there's that more is better approach, right? And kind of like, let's just throw all the data we have at this, and it's going to work out. And it goes back to the more is better is generally
Yeah.
directionally great, but more relevant is really the story here. And so kind of baking that into across the organization when thinking about data management and use in AI is super important. The second is not really kind of thinking through and establishing a strategy and a practice for how I go about taking all of these assets that are around me and digitizing them, tagging them, managing them, feeding them appropriately. It really is just kind of a, we always think kind of big data first, or all this data, digital data first, and not kind of what's sitting around me physically, what's sitting in the warehouses, what's sitting in the offices.
Right.
Are these relevant? Think about healthcare providers, right? And I worked in IT for a state government, and I ran a public health organization, software development. And one of the areas we had was epidemiology. And there was so much data that was sitting in written notes, in, you talk about PDFs, in different formats that can really feed into, when you think about kind of breaking down outbreaks and figuring out kind of, who patient zero is and how you
Right.
contain them. There's so much data that sits in there, that sits in closets, right? If I can find a way to unlock that data, that's fantastic. But we don't always think of these things as IT, and certainly IT, but certainly business leaders as well. And the third is security. How do I secure all this? How do I, as I'm going through this process of kind of data collection, data curation, data feeding, how do I implement the right security measures to make sure that it's protected internally and externally? Those are the three biggies. It's really kind of there are some organizations out there, or vendors out there, call it a unified asset strategy, right? Which is physical, digital, structured, unstructured, and a management of practice around that. I don't see that kind of being done en masse, if you will, as I talk to organizations.
I'm so glad you brought up the security thing. And, it's funny, out of one side of our mouth, it's like, hey, we want to get all this value out of this data. And then there's all these benefits, not out of the other, it's like, but beware, spooky, right?
Yeah.
Danger. But no, I think I loved the example of healthcare. And quite frankly, anybody that has a paper asset that needs to be, quite frankly, I'm convinced that this stuff doesn't need to be keyed in anymore, right?
Mhm.
So you can scan this stuff in, grab value of it, make it queryable. Once you make it digital, the security thing pops up, right? Which is, okay, well, who exactly do I want to get this data from? And having, not only a unified asset strategy, but a unified security strategy across this, I think, is really important. Hey, I would like to auger in. I love this term, unified asset strategy. Can you
Mhm.
do a little bit of a kind of a deeper dive? What does that actually mean in reality and in practice? I mean, you were a real life IT guy, right?
Yeah.
So let's hear it.
Yeah, I've actually lost a lot of hair, and what little hair I have has started to go gray because of that IT experience I have. I talked through it a bit without actually kind of explicitly kind of stating. So it's a good question. So when I talk about unified asset strategy, it's really kind of it starts out with an organization wide view of as I kind of look across as somebody who manages data or wants to make use of data. It's looking across my enterprise or my organization and understanding where all of my data might reside. That's part one, right? It sits in databases, it sits in data lakes, it sits on the edge, it sits in the going back to it sits in the files that are sitting in that closet. It sits in all of those recordings from a law firm, or let's say I'm a studio in Hollywood, right? All of that film that resides in some archival, offsite archival. It's looking across. If I'm a hospital, it's patient records. It's patients themselves. It's where are all of the sources of my data, potential sources of my data, and then figuring out a way in a standard set of policies, practices, and rules around how I take all of these assets, how I turn them from just kind of raw information into data, how I transform that data, how I put in policies around securing that data, and then it's a set of policies around how that data gets used within the organization. And some of this is already in place today, right? I mean, most enterprise organizations you talk to have some kind of set of data management policies in place. They might not be fully baked. They might not be as deep as we want them to be, but they're in place. It really is on that physical side where I see a lot of gaping holes within organizations, either because they haven't considered it or they haven't considered it fully. And so it's kind of, it's putting together a way essentially of governing, the data across my organization. And it's interesting because as you think through all of this and you think about, well, we can get into, well, no, let's jump into it now. If you think through all of this and you think about like how you take all of these physical assets that exist, right? Going back to my example of IT and public health, we literally had rooms full of records to support our epidemiologists that were out in the field. And they sat there, right? How do I go about, what's my process? What are my policies, procedures, and processes for taking all of that paper and turning it into digital assets? Am I going to go hire 50 people to scan all of this data in and then tag it and kind of and make sure that it gets placed in the right repository? Is that a smart approach to take, or is there a more strategic way to do this? Is it better to partner with a third party to do all that? It's kind of thinking through all of these things, if you will, all of these challenges, and putting in the policies and the practices that help you get from raw asset to secure data.
Yeah. So I have to ask, I mean, who's a third party that does this? Iron Mountain?
Strangely enough, yeah, they are, yeah, and they're an interesting company because, and I make this joke, or not make this joke, but I've told people in the past when I've talked about them, I actually interviewed them with them in like 1982, or I'm sorry, like 1986,
Yeah.
and didn't get the job. But anyway, yeah, when you think about them, right, they've been around forever, and their roots are in actually the physical asset business, right? They started out by taking bank records and records from law firms and kind of the Wall Street folks, and securely storing them within some offsite archival facility. And they've kind of they've transformed from this pure offsite archiving organization into, they're essentially a cloud provider, right? They do this, and they provide a set of services around their cloud capabilities and their software that help companies get from that A to B, right, or that A to Z, if you will. Kind of the process of taking physical, turning into digital, cleansing it, tagging it, making it ready for use. They've built practices around this, which is really interesting.
That really is interesting. So Matt, let's net this out for our viewers and our listeners here. What are your final recommendations as it relates to data, unified asset strategy? Talked about, a little bit about the information lifecycle to be able to take advantage of this new generative AI trend. And by the way, ML is not going away. Deep learning is not going away, and neither is analytics.
No,
Technology is additive.
that's right.
Very rarely do technologies just go away. So we're going to be doing analytics, machine learning, deep learning, generative AI, and whatever comes after generative
Yep.
AI in 2 or 3 years. So what are your recommendations, Matt, to IT?
Yeah. First, I agree with you 100% on that. I think Gen AI kind of spawns a lot more use cases. First is what my therapist always tells me, and that is acknowledge you have a problem.
That's
So,
good.
I think that, but it really though, I think a big part of this is understanding as a IT executive, as a business executive, as a data management person, understanding the depth of or the scope of your challenge that resides before you, right? Life's data management, information lifecycle management is not easy. And while a lot of companies have gotten a certain, or organizations have gotten a certain amount of the way there, if you will, they're not full. Understanding, kind of looking holistically across the organization, understanding where your assets are, understanding where your challenges are and your weaknesses, and building and using that as your baseline for building out an information lifecycle plan is step one. The second thing is kind of build out a strategy for assets, right? Going back to that example of the healthcare or the healthcare public health office in IT, those rooms full of data or papers that we had to support the epidemiologists, not all of that was relevant. Some of it goes back to the 1930s and with diseases that don't exist anymore, right? It's like, where is that line? What data is relevant? What data is not relevant? Understanding kind of what assets are important, what assets need to be digitized, going through the process of that, and putting together that plan for managing and fully optimizing all of your assets is really important, right? That unified asset strategy. And the third is to not go at this alone. A lot of
Yeah.
what we're talking about is it's kind of like machine learning, right? You have this like big model that you're training up front that requires a lot of work. And then there's inference that happens after that, right? So a lot of this effort is a one-time heavy lift of digitizing, of tagging, of cleansing, of categorizing. That's part one, and then it's kind of incremental after that. Find a partner that can help you take that first step, and then put together a plan that allows you to manage this going forward. Because if you go at it alone, you're going to miss something, and it's not because you're not good at what you do. It's not because you're not thorough, but it's because you are so hyper focused on your organization. Sometimes you miss the forest through the trees. So those are the three biggies.
Sage words of advice, Matt, and appreciate you bringing that to the table. And what I love about conversations with you is you are actually an operator and did this. So I think there's an extra element of credibility versus maybe people who work for vendors only. Who might that be? No, I do talk to probably one Fortune 500 CIO every 2 weeks, and I feel pretty good at pulse. And yeah, particularly when you get into regulated industries, they get a lot of this. Now they don't necessarily get how they're going to light up necessarily all the data that might be sitting in a warehouse somewhere. They have very little clues about that. But quite frankly, manufacturing areas that are less regulated, they don't fully understand it. But I think they will, as they
Yeah,
see their competitors lighting up these use cases across customer service, accounts payable, accounts receivable. I mean,
yeah,
some of these use cases are really coming to the forefront. And it's interesting. A lot of the stuff that wasn't changed in Web 1.0 and Web 2.0 are likely going to get impacted here with generative AI. So Matt, thanks
great.
for coming on and having this great discussion. I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
thanks for having me. Fun chat.
So this is Pat Moorhead for More Insights and Strategy with Matt Kimball. We are signing off here talking about the role of unified asset management with generative AI. Appreciate you tuning in. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe button. Check out all of the More Insights and Strategy podcasts out there. Have a great morning, day, afternoon, wherever you are on the planet. Take care.